Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive into current affairs. You know we like to keep you updated on the latest developments that could be important for your UPSC exams.
And today, we're tackling something pretty significant, India's first ever biannual transparency report on climate change.
This is definitely one for the notebooks, folks.
Absolutely. It's not just about the data itself, though.
Right, we're going to go deeper and see what it means for India's position in the whole global climate conversation.
So this report, the BTR, it's basically like India's report card on how we're doing when it comes to climate action.
So it's about transparency on greenhouse gas emissions.
Exactly. And it's all part of our commitments under the Paris Agreement.
Okay, so I get that we're being more transparent, but how is this different from those BRRs we used to have, those also reported on emissions, right?
Yeah, they did, but think of the BTR as like a supercharged burr.
Supercharged.
Yeah, it goes through a much tougher review process.
So like more accountability this time around?
Exactly. It's reviewed by international experts who are accredited by the UNFCCC. It's a whole other level of scrutiny.
Okay, got it. Higher stakes. So before we get into what this new report might say, let's back up a bit. What were the main takeaways from the last report, the BUR, for 2020? What did it tell us about India's emissions?
Well, that BUR gave us a snapshot of where things stood back then. It showed that our total greenhouse gas emissions, excluding forestry and land use, were around 2,959 million tons of CO2 equivalent.
Okay, that sounds like a lot.
It is a big number, but here's the interesting part. When you factor in the carbon that's absorbed by our forests, that number drops to 2,437 million tons.
So our forests were acting like a natural buffer even back then.
Exactly. Our green cover plays a huge role in absorbing carbon.
But still, 2,437 million tons. That's not insignificant. Where were these emissions coming from mainly? Which sectors were the biggest contributors?
The energy sector was the biggest culprit, by far responsible for a whopping 75.66% of emissions.
That makes sense. Power plants, transportation, industries, all heavily reliant on fossil fuels.
Exactly. Then came agriculture at 13.72%, followed by industrial processes at 8.06%. The waste sector contributed a much smaller 2.56%.
That breakdown helps to see where the bulk of the problem lies. There's a catch, right? This data is from 2020, the year the world kind of hit pause because of the pandemic.
Right, you've hit a crucial point there. The BUR captured a dip in emissions because of the lockdowns and reduced economic activity. So it'll be interesting to see how the BTR reflects things going back to normal post-pandemic.
I see what you mean. Higher emissions, stricter scrutiny. This BTR is shaping up to be quite a story. But let's zoom out for a second. Where does India stand globally when it comes to emissions?
That's where the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities comes in. While India contributes about 4 to 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, putting us among the top emitters, our per capita emissions are significantly lower than the global average, less than one-third to be precise.
Okay, so as a nation, we're emitting a lot. But individually, our footprint is much smaller. Why is that distinction so important in this whole climate change discussion?
Well, it's about historical responsibility. Developed nations industrialized earlier, so they bear a larger share of the responsibility for the current state of climate change.
So it's about recognizing that we all need to work towards a solution, but developed nations should take the lead.
Exactly. They need to make bigger cuts in their emissions and also provide financial and technological support to developing nations like India who are still on their path to development.
So it's about acknowledging that we're all in this together, but we have different starting points and different capacities to act.
Precisely. And this principle is key to understanding the BTR and how it might affect India's stance at upcoming climate summits.
That's a great point. So for our UPSC aspirants tuning in, what should they be watching for this upcoming BTR? What kind of information can we expect to see?
It will give us updated data up to 2022. And as we've discussed, we can anticipate an increase in emissions compared to 2020 simply because of the economic rebound after the pandemic.
Right? Makes sense. So it's not all doom and gloom, though, is it? I mean, India set some ambitious climate goals, hasn't it? That whole net zero by 2070 thing, that's a massive undertaking. Can you tell us a bit more about what that actually entails?
Of course. Reaching net zero by 2070 means we aim to balance out our emissions by removing an equal amount from the atmosphere.
So kind of like canceling them out.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged approach that involves rapidly expanding our renewable energy capacity. We have a target of 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel energy by 2030. That's a big jump.
Wow. So it's not just about cutting down emissions, it's also about enhancing carbon sequestration.
Exactly. Using our natural resources to soak up carbon from the atmosphere.
So like using nature's own carbon capture systems.
Precisely. India plans to increase its forest cover and promote sustainable land use practices.
Because trees are basically carbon-eating machines, right?
You got it. They absorb CO2 as they grow. So by protecting and expanding our forests, we can make a big difference in offsetting our emissions.
It's like a two-pronged attack, reducing emissions through clean energy and absorbing carbon through forests.
Exactly, and this BTR will likely go into detail about these efforts, showing how India is actually walking the talk on climate action.
That's reassuring to hear, but I have to ask, putting together all this data for the BTR, it must have been a huge task, right?
Oh, absolutely. Gathering accurate information across all these different sectors, it involves a lot of coordination between government agencies, research institutions, and even private organizations.
I can imagine. And then you have to make sure it all aligns with international reporting standards under the UNFCCC.
Right, and on top of that, you've got to account for those post-pandemic fluctuations in emission trends. It's a complicated process.
So a massive undertaking, but a crucial one for transparency and accountability on the global stage.
Exactly. It shows India's commitment to playing a responsible role in tackling this global challenge.
This has been a really insightful look into the BTR and what it means for India. We've learned about its importance, the key findings from the last BUR where India stands globally, and the challenges involved in putting it all together. But we've only just scratched the surface.
You're right. There's so much more to unpack here.
Exactly. In Part 2, we'll analyze how the BTR's findings might impact India's negotiating strategy at those upcoming climate summits. So stay tuned for more insights.
It's going to be a fascinating discussion.
It definitely is. We'll see you there.
Welcome back to our deep dive into India's first biannual transparency report on climate change.
Great to be back. So we've unpacked what the BTR is, looked at India's emissions and all that.
Yep, and how it fits into that whole global picture of climate action.
Right. Now let's shift gears a bit. Look ahead. How might this BTR actually affect India's game plan at those upcoming climate summits?
That's where things get really interesting, especially for our UPSC folks out there.
It's like we're stepping into the shoes of climate negotiators. What parts of the BTR could really matter in these international talks?
Well, one key thing is that projected increase in emissions after the pandemic.
Right, we talked about that.
It kind of strengthens India's argument that developing nations need some space to grow economically, even if it means emissions go up for a bit.
Which brings us back to that whole common but differentiated responsibilities idea.
Exactly.
We can't expect developing nations to just slam the brakes on progress while trying to hit these ambitious climate goals.
It wouldn't be fair. India's stance is that developed nations who've already industrialized, they have a historical responsibility here.
Right, they need to lead the charge in cutting emissions.
And provide financial and technological support to developing nations like India as we transition to cleaner energy.
It's about finding that balance between development and climate action.
With a focus on equity and shared responsibility.
I like that shared responsibility.
The BTR, by showing this likely rise in emissions, it gives data to back up this argument.
It's like India can say, look, we're committed to the Paris Agreement, but we need a realistic path to reach our goals.
Exactly, a path that's fair to everyone.
Okay, so the BTR helps strengthen India's position. But it's not just about pointing fingers, right? It's about showing what India's doing, too.
Absolutely. The report will highlight the steps India's taken towards its goals.
Things like expanding renewable energy.
Yep, and enhancing carbon sequestration through forestry.
It's about showing the world, hey, we're not just talking, we're walking the walk.
Exactly. We're doing our part, and we expect the international community to support our efforts.
Makes sense. So how do you see the BTR influencing India's overall negotiation strategy at these summits?
Well, I think it gives India a stronger voice. It provides the data to advocate for a fair and equitable approach to climate action.
And it shows India's commitment to transparency and accountability.
Which builds credibility on the world stage.
It's about building trust through transparency.
Precisely. The BTR isn't just a report, it's a strategic tool.
Wow. That India can use to protect its interests while contributing to a global solution.
Now, this raises a good question for our UPSC aspirants. How might other nations react to the BTR's findings? And how could that affect the whole negotiation game?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's like a game of chess.
Right. Trying to anticipate the other players' moves, I think reactions will be mixed.
For sure.
Developed nations might be concerned about that projected increase in emissions.
I could see that.
They might urge India to speed up the switch to clean energy.
Makes sense. But what about other developing nations?
Well, those facing similar challenges, they might see India as a leader.
A champion for their cause.
Leading to alliances and coalitions forming around shared interests.
Wow. It's fascinating how one report can have such a ripple effect globally.
Climate negotiations, they're incredibly complex, diverse players, sometimes conflicting interests.
For sure.
The BTR, by making India's position clear, it could change the dynamics of these talks in ways we don't even expect.
It's not just about the data itself, it's about the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
UPSC aspirants need to understand that.
The BTR, it's a window into India's environmental policy, its international relations.
And its vision for a sustainable future.
Okay, so we've talked about the global implications.
Right.
But let's bring it back home. What about the impact within India?
Yeah. How might these findings affect things here at home?
That's where the BTR's true power lies.
Let's dive into that. Let's unpack those domestic implications in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. See you there.
All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into India's first biannual transparency report on climate change.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have. We talked about the BTR shaking things up globally, how it might give India more leverage in those international climate negotiations.
And all the complex dynamics it could create on that world stage.
Right. Now let's zoom in. What impact could the BTR have within India itself? How could it affect things like policies, businesses, even how much people care about climate change?
That's where things get really interesting because the real power of the BTR is its potential to drive change right here at home.
I like that, driving change. Let's start with policymaking. How could the BTR actually inform and shape India's approach to environmental policies?
Well, the BTR, it's full of data on emissions from all sorts of sectors.
Right.
And that's super valuable for policymakers. It highlights the areas that need attention.
The ones that need a bit of a nudge in the right direction.
Exactly. It shows where progress has been made and where there are still gaps.
So it's kind of like a roadmap for policymakers.
Exactly. Leading them towards more effective and targeted strategies. Let's say the BTR shows a big jump in emissions from transportation.
Okay.
That could lead to policies to encourage electric vehicles, improving public transport, incentivizing those fuel-efficient technologies.
It's about making smart decisions based on evidence, not just guesswork.
Precisely. And the BTR could also affect policies on renewable energy, forestry, waste management, even urban planning.
So it's not just about the Environment Ministry. It has implications across the board.
Exactly. The BTR has the potential to get the whole government working together on climate action.
I like that, a whole-of-government approach. Now, what about the business world? How might the BTR's findings affect what companies do and how they approach sustainability?
Well, it sends a pretty clear message to businesses' transparency and accountability on environmental performance. They're not optional anymore.
They're becoming the norm.
Exactly. Companies are going to be under more pressure to reduce emissions, adopt sustainable practices, and be open about their environmental performance.
So we might see more companies jumping on the sustainability bandwagon.
Absolutely. Businesses are realizing that being green is not just good for the planet, it's good for the bottom line, too.
It makes sense. We can expect to see companies investing in renewable energy, becoming more energy efficient, reducing waste, even looking into carbon offsetting.
Exactly. It's not just about following the rules anymore. It's about companies recognizing the benefits of being environmentally responsible.
Both for their reputation and their profits. Now let's talk about the everyday person. How might the BTR's findings impact public awareness and how much people care about climate change?
The BPR, by making all that data easier to understand, it can really raise awareness about how urgent climate action is.
It's about bringing the science down to earth, making it relevant to people's lives.
Exactly. The BTR could spark conversations, debates, even empower people to demand more action from their leaders and from businesses.
So people taking ownership of the issue and pushing for change.
Absolutely. We could see a rise in citizen-led movements, advocacy groups, even just individuals making changes to reduce their own carbon footprint.
It's about creating that sense of shared responsibility.
Exactly. Empowering everyone to do their part in tackling climate change.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. We've gone from the global stage to right here at home. We've looked at how the BTR could affect international negotiations, policymaking, businesses, and even public awareness.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, and it shows that climate action isn't just for governments or big corporations. It's something we all need to be part of.
It requires us to change the way we think and act.
And the BTR, by making things more transparent and accountable, it could be the push we need to make those changes happen.
It's a chance for India to show its commitment to a sustainable future.
To inspire action, and to lead the way towards a greener, more equitable world.
I think that sums it up nicely.
It does. For our UPSC aspirants listening in, remember the BTR. It's not just a report. It's a glimpse into how India's environmental policies are evolving, its place on the world stage, and its vision for a sustainable future. Keep an eye on this document, analyze its findings, and think critically about what it all means.
It's going to be a game changer in the years to come.
It definitely will. Don't forget to like this video if you found it helpful, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into crucial UPSC topics, and leave a comment below if you have any questions. And as always, today's deep dive was based on information from The Hindu. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay ahead in your UPSC journey.